In this section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the period after World War II, known as the Golden Age. In the aftermath of World War II, it was necessary for countries in Europe to rebuild. That happened relatively rapidly. So in this table, I've got information on various countries in Europe. The first column is a column you've seen before, where is represented information on the pre-war year when GDP was the same as in 1945. So for example, made the point before that in Austria, the last time GDP was the same as it was in 1945 was 1886. In other words, World War II had the effect of pushing Austrian GDP back to the level it was at 60 years before. The second column is a new column, and you can see that this column is about the year when GDP recovered its highest pre-war level. So prior to World War II occurring, perhaps say 1939, Austrian GDP would have been at a particular level, and this column is asking at what point after World War II did GDP get back to that level. And you can see that even though World War II had pushed Austria back 60 years in terms of its level of GDP, it only took 6 years for it to recover the losses that had occurred, or the distance by which it had been put back. And if you look through the column, you'll see that in all countries, the rebuilding or the recovery after World War II occurred relatively quickly. So within several years, countries were able to sort of undo the damage that had been done by World War II. And you can see that there were very high annual rates of GDP growth during this phase of reconstruction, consistent with the idea that the reconstruction occurred quickly. The rebuilding initiated a period of rapid economic growth that was to last until the mid-1970s. And so here I've got some data for Western Europe, the European periphery and Eastern Europe on average annual rates of economic of growth in GDP per capita. And the big point to note for the purposes of this section is that all of those regions, Western Europe, the European periphery, Eastern Europe, had, in relative terms, very high rates of growth in real GDP per capita annual during this period. So you can see 4 much higher than before the 1950s, or was to occur after the mid-1970s. Similarly for the European periphery, and similarly for Eastern Europe as well. The basis of this strong economic growth was twofold. First of all, there was strong growth in the amount of physical capital per worker. So this table is telling you about the contribution of growth in the amount of physical capital, like machinery, sort of infrastructure per worker. This is the human capital per worker, and this is total factor productivity, our measure of sort of improvements in efficiency. And so each of these numbers tells us about the annual contribution over this period of each of these elements to overall growth in GDP. And so basically the point is to look for sort of the numbers which are largest. Those are the factors that have had the biggest effect on growth. And I've used two different sets of numbers here from 2 different studies, which take slightly different approaches to measuring physical capital and measuring efficiency. But you can see that both the sets of numbers are providing relatively consistent stories, that the 2 big things that drove growth during this period were, first of all, growth in physical capital per worker. So these economies in Europe, France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, United Kingdom, and the other economies grew because they were able to introduce, utilise much larger amounts of physical capital and infrastructure than had been the case before. And they also grew because of improvements that were made to efficiency, so improvements in the way production occurred. Increases in human capital per worker sort of somewhat important, having a positive influence. So that's the effect of, say, increases in education, but not as relatively important as physical capital or improvements in efficiency. Another important characteristic of this period was it often referred to as sort of a period of the consumer revolution. So there were big increases in the proportion of people owning their own motor vehicles, and a big increase in the range and quality of motor vehicles that could be purchased. Large increases in the proportion of people owning household durable goods such as refrigerators and washing machines, and a big increase in ownership of home entertainment type goods such as televisions and radios. So there was this strong economic growth, and it was manifested sort of one way in which it was manifested was in a rapid increase in the variety and amount of consumer goods that were available to households. When we think about why this period of rapid economic growth, why this golden age occurred, there's three main reasons that we can identify. First reason is what's known as catch-up. So in this graph I've got GDP per capita on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. And the idea is that, look, there's some country which, if it hadn't experienced any disruption, would have sort of followed this path of economic growth. But what happened was there was some disruption. For example, in the instance we're talking about at the moment, there was World War II, there was the Great Depression. After that disruption finishes, so after, for example, World War II finishes, the idea is that countries can move back to the path they were on. So initially you're moving along the path, then there's some major event which disrupts economic growth, which pushes you off the path to a lower level, for example, of GDP per capita. But at some point event's going to end, and when it ends, the circumstances that were preventing you from continuing to move along this path are no longer there, and so you can move back onto that path you were on. And that's a phenomenon known as catch-up. So, for example, during World War II, countries are diverting a lot of their resources towards the military sector. They're having physical resources which are destroyed because they're involved in military activity. That's a disruption to growth. But once the war finishes, those disruptions no longer exist, and the country can divert all its productive resources, or increasingly use its productive resources for producing agricultural industrial goods. The second driver of rapid growth is what's called convergence. Convergence is the idea that there's a leading country, for example, the United States during this period, and there are following countries. And the following country you can see sort of has a level of GDP per capita the way I've drawn it, which is below the leading country. But at some point, the following country can start to adopt technologies which are being used in the leading country. So the leading country, the reason it has GDP per capita above the following country, or one major reason, is likely to be the types of production technologies that it's using. It's using more efficient, better production technologies. That's why it's getting more output per member of the population. So then, the following country, if it can start to take some of those technologies from the leading country, can begin to converge towards the leading country. And so, second reason we can see sort of rapid growth during this period is the idea that countries in Europe were taking these technologies from the United States and implementing them in their economies, and therefore their level of GDP per capita, because they're now using this frontier technology, is going to move towards the United States. And that's going to be associated with sort of a more rapid rate of economic growth while that convergence is happening. a couple of empirical perspectives on convergence. So in this graph I've got GDP per capita in different regions of the world expressed as a percentage of US GDP. And so up the top here is Western Europe, and so this is 1950 to 1973, the period of the Golden Age, and you can see what's happening is that GDP in Western Europe is increasing from about 55 to 75% of that in the United States. So Western Europe is certainly during this period converging towards the GDP per capita that was in the United States. You can see the other region of the world where there was rapid convergence was in Japan. And that's something we'll come back to in the next lecture, in fact. Other regions of the world, though, other parts of Asia, Eastern Europe and Latin America, you can see didn't experience anything like that degree of convergence. Another perspective on convergence is to think at the country level within Europe. And so here the idea is that there are, in fact, rather than thinking of sort of one follower country and the leader, there are a whole lot of followers. And the followers are different distances behind the leader. And the bigger distance you are behind the leader, the more scope you have to grow by taking technology from the leader. So the further you are behind the leader, the more rapidly you're going to be able to grow if you start to take production technology from the leader. So what this graph shows is on the vertical axis the annual average rate of, or the average annual rate of growth in GDP per capita from 1950 to 1973 and GDP per capita in 1950. So countries which are further out here are the countries which are rich relatively in Western Europe in 1950. Back here are the countries which were less rich. Countries up here are the countries which grew more in the period from 50 to 73. Countries down here are the countries which grew less. And what you can see in these pattern of dots is exactly the idea of convergence. That in 1950, Switzerland and the United Kingdom had GDP per capita that was higher. They were already closer to the United States. So we'd see them as having less scope to grow by taking technologies from the United States. And in fact, they grow less from 1950 to 73. Whereas up here, we've got Greece and Spain. Greece and Spain are less rich countries in 1950, so they have more scope to grow by taking technology from the leading country, the United States. And in fact, that's what we observe. We observe that they are the countries which grew most in this period from 1950 to 1973. The third main driver of economic growth in this period is structural change. Basically, the transfer of workers from agriculture to industry. And in this graph, you see that that type of structural change was certainly occurring during this period. In Austria, for example, about a third of the workforce in agriculture in 1950, down to 13% in 1974. France, 30% to 10%. Italy, 40% to 17%. So the Golden Age was a period when countries in Europe were increasingly shifting their workers from agriculture to industry. Now, why does that matter for economic growth? Well, it matters because workers in most of these economies are more productive if they're supplying their labour to industry than agriculture. So, for example, on average, a worker in France in industry was 50% less productive in agriculture than in industry. So they added 50% less to GDP in France working in agriculture than in industry. In Italy, the number was even bigger, 70% less productive in agriculture than industry. So when you take a worker from agriculture, you're taking them from sort of a low output sector and putting them into a sector where they make a much higher contribution to output. So by shifting the workers from low output to high output areas of economic activity, you're boosting the total amount of output in the economy. And so you can see that these estimates for some of the countries of the effect of this structural change shows potentially quite large effects on labour productivity growth. So for example, in Denmark, it's estimated that the transfer of workers from agriculture to industry, 25% in agriculture in 1950, 10% in 1974, added between 0.5% and about 1% to labour productivity growth each year. Or in Italy, where there was a particularly big transfer, from about 0.8% to 1.8% per year. So structural change, sectoral transfer of workers, was a third major influence on rapid economic growth during this golden age. Now, it's one thing to say that countries had the scope to grow, that because of the World War, that because they were behind the technological leader, that because they still had lots of workers in agriculture, that there was the scope for these countries in Europe to grow rapidly. But it's another thing to actually make that happen. That's a point that's been made by Moses Abramovich, where he says, the combination of technological gap and social capability defines a country's potentiality for productivity advance by way of catch-up. This, however, should be regarded as potentiality. The pace at which this potentiality is realised depends on another set of causes. Facilities for diffusion of knowledge, conditions facilitating or hindering structural change, and macroeconomic and monetary conditions encouraging and sustaining capital investment. And so when we think about Europe growing rapidly during this golden age, it's important to think about Europe meeting these three conditions. First of all, it is the case that Europe was highly suited to bring technology from the United States. So the fact that they shared the English language, the fact that relatively high proportions of engineers and scientists in Europe, the fact that there was an orientation towards vocational education in many parts of Europe meant that, or facilitated the diffusion of knowledge that was needed to be able to bring US technology to Europe. Second factor is structural change. Structural change is about countries in Europe being able to pay for the new capital which they needed to bring in to be the basis for industries in Europe, and also there needed to be assurance that the capital could be applied productively in order for there to be incentives for entrepreneurs to invest in that capital. Barry Eichengreen, a major economic historian, has been particularly influential in suggesting that Europe was particularly suited sort of in this period for accomplishing this type of structural change. That this structural change was about what Eichengreen describes as extensive growth, that is bringing in lots of new capital equipment via brute force. And he argues that Europe was well suited in terms of planning and a corporatist approach to policy making to accomplish this bringing in of new capital. He argues that the problem to be solved was no mystery. Initiating extensive growth required undertaking a constellation of complementary investments, mainly mass production industries pioneered previously by the United States. And he argues that Europe, as I've said on the last slide, was well suited in terms of planning and corporatist approaches to policy making. So first of all, government planning was quite strongly involved in this period of capital accumulation. Planning was a strong role of government was feasible because the capital accumulation that was needed was relatively targeted. It was in a specific group of sectors in the economy, often which involved sort of large-scale enterprises. So the problem of capital accumulation was a problem that could feasibly be managed by government because it was a relatively targeted problem. It was also a problem, Eichengreen argues, where it was important for government to be involved because government solved what might have otherwise been market failure problems. For example, to get industrialisation going, you really needed, as Eichengreen suggests here, investment in a group of complementary industry sectors. So, for example, you needed development of the steel production sector, you needed development of the transport sector, you needed development of coal mining sector to provide the energy for transport and steel production. And arguably, in a decentralized economy, it's more difficult to sort of achieve simultaneous development in those different sectors of the economy. But with government planning, what government can do is it can direct economic activity towards those sectors at the same time. For example, the Monnet Plan in France in the late 1940s allowed government to have a role in directing bank credit towards particular sectors of the economy. So in this period, planning was both feasible and necessary to get the capital accumulation that was required. The other aspect of European institutions at this point in time was their corporatist nature. And this is relevant in terms of the problem of giving an incentive to invest. So capital accumulation is making an investment. You pay up front for new capital equipment, and that capital equipment then earns you a return in the future that you can use to pay back the cost of the investment. Entrepreneurs who were thinking about making those investments needed to know that once they'd made the investment, that the profits they earned from that investment weren't going to be, for example, gobbled up by government taxation or gobbled up by high wage demands by workers. But equally, workers who perhaps accepted some wage trade-off in return for giving security to entrepreneurs that they'd earn a reasonable rate of return on capital investment needed to know that they weren't going to be exploited in some way in the future, that they were going to earn a reasonable return on their labour as well. And Europe at this time had corporatist institutions which really facilitated a partnership between government, employers and unions or workers in a way that allowed them to deal with this incentive problem that might have otherwise existed. So it seems that in this period, Europe had institutions, the ability to plan, and its corporatist institutions that made it well suited to capital accumulation. The other sort of factor which was involved in capital accumulation, giving an incentive to accumulate capital, was international trade. So in the aftermath of World War II, Europe was increasingly sort of, or countries within Europe were increasingly opening up to international trade, particularly sort of within Europe, where you had the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Free Trade Association, creating sort of customs unions within Europe, between which, so increasingly sort of trade could occur at lower cost between countries in Europe. And so that greater scope for countries to trade with each other increased the returns to investing in capital equipment. The other condition that Abramovich mentions of macroeconomic stability also existed in Europe during this period. A combination of a lack of shocks or disturbances to the economy, and perhaps also to some extent improved ability of government to manage the economy, meant that this was a relatively stable period, and so provided an environment in which there could be investment in capital equipment, in which there could be a focus on increasing the level of economic activity without needing to deal with sort of other major economic issues. One thing that you observe, for example, on the graph that I showed about the different rates of economic growth of countries in Europe in this period, is that there were differences in rates of growth between different countries in Europe. So as well as explaining sort of why on average there was rapid growth in Europe, it's also useful to say something briefly about why differences existed between countries. The first reason sort of we've already really dealt with in that graph that I just mentioned, that that countries grew at different rates because they had different scope for catch-up and convergence. Countries that had been pushed more off their growth path by the disruption of World War II, they had more scope to catch up by growing once that disturbance finishes. Countries which were more distance behind the technological leader had more scope to grow because they had a bigger distance to catch up to the leader. Another factor is that countries in Europe came out of World War II with different scope to benefit from structural change. So whereas in the United Kingdom after World War II, there was a very low proportion of workers still in agriculture, so the United Kingdom had virtually zero scope to increase its rate of economic growth by transferring workers from agriculture to industry. In other economies like France and Italy, there was still substantial scope to grow in that way. So that's a second factor that explains why countries grew at different rates. To the extent that we think that the institutions in Europe were important in explaining why rapid economic development occurs, then to the extent that those institutions differed between countries may be an explanatory factor for different rates of growth as well. So, for example, differences in the ability of countries to plan, assist by planning capital accumulation, or differences in the extent to which countries are able to apply a corporatist approach. For example, it seems that a corporatist approach could be more easily implemented where the union structure was one of industry unions, such as in Germany, rather than sort of more craft-based type unions of the United Kingdom. Another aspect of, for example, incentives for government policy is, incentives for capital accumulation is government policy, so differences in tax rates between countries may have been a contributing factor to the differences in the amount of capital accumulation that occurred and therefore the extent to which economic growth occurs. And there are also likely to be country-specific factors. So, for example, Ireland in this period looks like it grew sort of less quickly than you might have thought, given the level of GDP per capita it began with in this period. You know, and perhaps that might be due to its geographic location, being sort of distant from the rest of Europe, or not on continental Europe, and links to the UK, which was a slower growing part of Europe. So that's a perspective on the Golden Age. In the next section of this lecture, I'll go on to talk about the period when the Golden Age came to an end from the mid-1970s.